I never believed in ghosts. I always thought they were just stories to scare children or keep us awake at night. But that was before I moved into the old Whitmore house on the edge of town. It was a steel, a beautiful Victorian with creaky floorboards, large windows that seemed to stare out into nothing, and a history shrouded in mystery. Most people avoided it. They said it was haunted, but I was drawn to its charm and affordable price. I figured I could ignore the ghost stories. The first night in the house was uneventful. I unpacked my boxes and set up a makeshift bed on the floor of what would be my bedroom. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, the wind howled outside, sending chills through the old wood. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I felt like I was being watched. On the second night, things started to change. I woke up to a soft whisper echoing through the hallway. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves. I got out of bed and crept toward the sound, curiosity gnawing at me. The air grew colder as I approached the stairs. I paused, hesitating for a moment, but the whispering continued, beckoning me closer. I climbed the creaking steps, the wood groaning under my weight. As I reached the top, the whispering faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to head back to my room when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted past the end of the hallway. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I strained to listen, my ears ringing with silence. Gathering my courage, I edged closer to the darkened hallway, peering into the gloom. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing answered, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I turned and hurried back to my room, like slamming the door behind me. I collapsed onto my makeshift bed, trying to shake off the unease. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just the house settling. The next few nights were restless. I heard whispers more frequently, and the shadows seemed to dance just beyond my sight. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses creak and groan. They have history. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the fourth night, the whispers turned into soft sobbing. It echoed through the halls, a heart-wrenching sound that made my skin crawl. I tossed and turned in my bed, but sleep eluded me. I knew I had to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, I tiptoed into the hallway. The sobbing grew louder as I made my way to the living room, where the fireplace lay dormant and the shadows loomed large. I swept the light across the room, but it illuminated only the empty space, casting long shadows that danced ominously around me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The sobbing stopped. An oppressive silence filled the air, and my heart raced as I strained to hear anything. Then a sudden chill swept through the room, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned to find a figure standing in the corner, barely illuminated by the flickering light. It was a woman, her long hair hanging limply around her face, and she wore a tattered white dress that flowed like smoke. I blinked, and she was gone. Just like that, she vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the chill of her presence. Panicking, I sprinted back to my room and locked the door, my heart pounding like a drum. I pressed my back against the door, fighting the urge to scream. I was terrified. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, but I didn't want to let the ghost win. I needed answers. The next day, I visited the town library to dig into the history of the Whitmore house. After hours of searching through old newspapers and records, I uncovered the tragic story of Margaret Whitmore, the last resident of the house. She was said to have lost her child under mysterious circumstances, and her grief consumed her. Rumors swirled that she could still be heard crying in the night. That night, armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront the spirit. I set up a makeshift seance in the living room, candles flickering around me as I spoke Margaret's name. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and I felt the temperature drop as I called out to her. "Margaret, I know your story. You're not alone. I'm here to help you." As I spoke, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candles one by one until only one flickered weakly. I could feel her presence, a heaviness that settled in the air. "Please, tell me what you want," I urged. Suddenly, the last candle flickered violently before going out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, and as I turned it on, I saw her. Margaret stood before me, her face twisted in sorrow, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. "I lost her," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "I never found her." I stepped back, my heart racing. "What do you mean? Where is she?" But before she could respond, the shadows around her began to swirl, thickening into a dark mist. The room grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I backed away, stumbling into the furniture. Please, I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. Let me help you find her. In that moment, the shadows surged toward me, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me closer to Margaret. I could feel her sorrow enveloping me, threatening to drown me in despair. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of wails and cries. Just as I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, I remembered the stories of closure. Margaret, if you can hear me, you need to let go. Find peace. The shadows hesitated, and I took a deep breath, mustering all my courage. Your daughter is not lost to you. She's at peace. You can be too. You just need to let her go. The mist shivered, swirling around as Margaret's face twisted in confusion. Let her go, she echoed, and for a moment, the sorrow lifted from her features. With a final shudder, the shadows retreated, leaving me gasping for breath. I watched as Margaret's figure began to fade, a look of calm replacing the sorrow in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, before disappearing completely. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The house was still, peaceful even. I stepped outside, the morning air fresh and invigorating. I had faced the darkness, and it no longer haunted me. But as I turned to look back at the Whitmore house, I couldn't help but wonder if the shadows would return for someone else. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not until I moved into the old house on Sycamore Street. It was a rental, cheap, quiet, and tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The perfect place for me to escape the hectic life I'd been living. I needed solitude, a space to think. Little did I know I would soon be desperate for company, for anything alive to keep me from the terror lurking inside. It all started the first night. The house was cold. Not the kind of cold that you can shake off with a thick blanket or a hot cup of tea. It felt like the very air was drained of warmth, like it had been sucked dry by something unseen. I shrugged it off as the result of an old heating system. But as the night grew darker, the cold seemed to intensify. By midnight, it had seeped into my bones. I was lying in bed, struggling to fall asleep, when I first heard it. A faint whisper. Just a breath, really. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracked windows, so I pulled the blanket tighter around me and shut my eyes. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. My name, Daniel. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was calling me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up quickly, staring into the dark room. My eyes scanned the shadows, looking for something, anything, but there was nothing there. Just the stillness of the empty room. I tried to convince myself that I was hearing things, that it was my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was tired, stressed, and overwhelmed. I wasn't the type to scare easily, so I lay back down, forcing myself to ignore the creeping dread that was gnawing at the edges of my mind. The whisper didn't stop. Daniel. It was closer now, almost right next to my ear. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The room was bathed in a dim, yellowish glow, and I saw it. Just for a split second. A figure standing in the corner of the room. It was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only a deep, suffocating cold in its place. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I stayed up, lights on, eyes wide open, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that it was a dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But it wasn't just one night. Every night after that, the whisper came. It called my name again and again, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. I started to dread the evenings. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to be alone in the dark. It got worse. The whispers turned into something else, something sinister. I would hear faint footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the floorboards, as though someone was pacing outside my door. Once, I woke up to find the door wide open, even though I had locked it before going to bed. The air would grow impossibly cold, like I'd stepped into a freezer, and that smell, the smell of rotting, decaying flesh, would fill the air. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was haunting me. I researched the house, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe someone had died here, maybe there was a tragic history behind the place. And then I found it. The previous tenant, a man named Robert Hendricks, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No body was ever found. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the vanishing, but no one knew for sure what had happened. There were rumors of strange occurrences in the house before his disappearance, just like the ones I was experiencing. But no one had been able to stay long enough to figure it out. That night, the cold was unbearable. I could see my breath in the air as I sat on the edge of my bed, waiting for the thing to show itself. And it did. The figure appeared at the foot of my bed, its pale face gaunt, eyes hollow and black. It whispered my name again, but this time it wasn't asking for me to come to it. It wanted something else. Help me. The voice was raspy, desperate. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, unable to move. It reached out a hand, long, bony fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward me. And then I felt it, the cold touch. It gripped my arm, and the sensation shot through my body like ice water. In that moment, a flood of images flashed through my mind. The figure wasn't a ghost, not entirely. It was Robert Hendricks, or what was left of him. He had been trapped here, unable to move on, consumed by whatever dark force lived in the house. He hadn't just disappeared, he had been taken by the same thing that was now coming for me. I yanked my arm away from the cold grasp and ran out of the room, out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, breathless and shaking. I never went back. I sold everything I owned and left that town behind, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That faint whisper. My name. The cold touch. And I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I've always been curious. It's a trait that served me well in my line of work as an antiques dealer, but sometimes curiosity leads you to places you'd rather not go. It started with an old mirror, a heavy, ornate thing with a thick, gilded frame. The moment I saw it tucked away in the corner of that musty attic, I knew I had to have it. The house belonged to Mrs. Hawthorne, an elderly widow whose family had lived there for generations. She was selling off old furniture, and the mirror had caught my eye immediately. It stood at least 6 feet tall, its surface slightly tarnished from years of neglect, but still reflecting an eerie, dim glow from the dusty attic light. The intricate carvings on the frame depicted twisted vines and strange, grotesque faces. It was beautiful in a strange, unsettling way. "You sure you want that one?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked me, her voice trembling slightly. "That mirror's old. Older than anything else here." That didn't bother me. The older, the better. That's where the real value was. I figured she was just trying to get more money out of me. "How much?" I asked, ignoring the strange look she gave me. She hesitated, her eyes flickering over to the mirror. "Take it. Just take it. No charge. But don't say I didn't warn you." I should have paid more attention to that last part, but I was too excited about my find. I loaded the mirror into the back of my truck and drove it home, oblivious to the creeping unease that had begun to settle in the pit of my stomach. Back at my apartment, the mirror fit perfectly in my living room. It was large, but it had a certain presence, like it belonged there, commanding attention. I cleaned the surface, polishing it until the glass gleamed. That's when I noticed something strange. As I wiped away the last of the dust, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection. But it wasn't me. There was something behind me. I spun around quickly, but of course nothing was there. I shook it off, blaming my exhaustion. Long days of treasure hunting and restoration could mess with anyone's mind. But over the next few days, the strange things continued. At first, it was subtle. I'd glance at the mirror and see the room reflected back at me, except for small differences. A shadow in the corner, a flicker of movement, things out of place. I started to avoid looking at it directly, brushing off the feelings of discomfort that had begun to gnaw at me. Then, one night, it got worse. I was sitting on the couch, the room dimly lit, when I heard a soft creak behind me. It sounded like someone was walking across the floor, but I was alone. My eyes darted to the mirror, and what I saw froze me in place. There was a figure in the reflection, standing just behind me. It was tall and gaunt, with long, stringy hair hanging over its pale face. Its eyes were wide, hollow, and black, staring straight at me. I turned around, my heart pounding, but again there was nothing. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, still watching me. I jumped off the couch, my skin crawling. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to cover the mirror, to block whatever was in there from getting out. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the glass, hoping that would stop the strange occurrences. It didn't. That night, I woke to the sound of whispering. Low, guttural voices that seemed to come from all around me. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on me. My eyes were drawn to the living room, where the mirror was hidden beneath the blanket. The voices were coming from there. I felt a chill run down my spine as I walked slowly toward the living room. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, until they were deafening. I could hear my own name being repeated over and over in that horrible, rasping tone. When I reached the mirror, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the blanket. Something deep inside me screamed not to do it. But I had to know. I had to see. I pulled the blanket away. The mirror was no longer reflecting my living room. Instead, it showed a dark, endless void. And from that void, the figure was stepping out. Slowly it emerged, its long, bony fingers reaching toward me. Its hollow eyes locked on mine, filled with malice and hunger. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming out. The thing in the mirror was coming for me. I ran to the door, yanking it open and fleeing into the night. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, my chest heaving, my mind reeling. I called a friend, explained what had happened, and stayed at their place that night. The next morning, I returned to the apartment, determined to get rid of the mirror once and for all. But when I walked in, it was gone. The entire mirror, frame and all, had vanished. There was no trace of it, as if it had never been there. I searched every inch of the apartment, but there was nothing, just the faint echo of those whispers still lingering in the air. I moved out the next day. Whatever was in that mirror, it wasn't finished with me, and sometimes late at night I still hear the whispering growing louder, closer. I know it's only a matter of time before the mirror finds me again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I've always hated moving. The packing, the boxes, the way everything feels unsettled and unfamiliar. But this time it felt different. Worse. Maybe it was because of the house. There was something off about it from the moment I stepped inside. It was an old Victorian place, with high ceilings and creaky floors, but what really struck me was the door. At the end of a long, narrow hallway on the second floor, there was a door painted a deep, unsettling shade of red. It looked out of place in the otherwise dull and faded house. There was no keyhole, no handle, and the paint was chipped and worn as if it had been there for centuries. When the realtor showed me the house, I asked about it, but she just shrugged. "It's been sealed for as long as anyone can remember," she said. "No one's ever been able to open it." That should have been my first clue to stay away. But curiosity got the better of me. I moved in the following week, ignoring the uneasy feeling the house gave me. For the first few days, everything was fine. The house was quiet, if a little cold, and I quickly got into the rhythm of unpacking and settling in. But no matter how much I tried to avoid it, my eyes kept drifting back to that red door. It was always there, looming at the end of the hallway, as if it was watching me. One night, after I'd been living there for about a week, I heard it. A faint tapping. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone was gently knocking on the other side of the red door. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door, my heart racing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tapping wouldn't stop. It echoed down the hall, wrapping around me like a cold wind. I walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. My hand hovered in the air for a moment before I pressed my palm against the wood. It was ice cold to the touch, colder than the rest of the house. I knocked back once, lightly. The tapping stopped. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. But the silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. Just as I was about to turn and walk away, there was a sound, a slow, deliberate scrape, like something dragging its nails across the inside of the door. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, my eyes glued to the door. It was sealed shut, no handle, no way to open it. But I knew, deep down, that something was on the other side. That night, I didn't sleep. The next few days were worse. The tapping returned, louder, more frequent. It happened at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes I'd hear it while I was making breakfast, other times in the dead of night when the rest of the world was silent. I stopped going upstairs, refusing to walk down that hallway. I'd hear it from the bottom of the stairs, that same rhythmic knock, calling me, taunting me. Then came the whispers. They started softly, barely audible, like a breeze slipping through a crack in the window. I couldn't make out what they were saying at first, but they were constant. It was always when I was near the red door. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were right next to my ear. I'd lie awake at night, my mind buzzing with fear, wondering what was behind that door. One evening, the whispers were so loud I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox in the basement and marched up the stairs, fueled by a mixture of fear and frustration. When I reached the door, I could hear them clearly now, a chorus of voices, faint and hissing, calling my name. "Come closer. Let us out." My hand trembled as I raised the hammer. I swung it hard against the wood, splintering the paint and cracking the surface. I hit it again and again until the wood gave way. The door fell open with a deafening creak. Behind the door was a small, windowless room, lit only by the flickering glow of a single candle. The walls were covered in strange, dark symbols. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they filled me with dread. In the center of the room, there was a chair, and in that chair sat a figure. It was a woman, or at least it had been at one time. Her skin was gray and withered, stretched tightly over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that stared straight through me. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, and her head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Her bony fingers were wrapped around the arms of the chair, nails digging into the wood. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed by fear. She didn't speak, but the whispers filled the room, growing louder, more frantic. They came from all around me, echoing off the walls, rising in pitch until it felt like they were piercing through my skull. Suddenly, the woman's head snapped up, her black eyes locking onto mine. Her grin widened, and she slowly rose from the chair, her bones creaking with every movement. My heart raced as she took a step toward me, her feet dragging across the floor. The whispers turned into screams, shrill and agonizing. As she reached out her hand, her fingers long and twisted. I stumbled back, tripping over the threshold, and slammed the door shut. I pressed my back against it, breathing hard as the screams echoed from the other side. I could hear her scratching at the door, her nails raking across the wood. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cold night. I never went back into that house. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted, but I could still hear it sometimes in my dreams. The tapping, the whispers calling me back to the red door. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I've always loved the woods. Growing up in a small town surrounded by thick forests, it felt like home to me. So when I bought a cabin deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest neighbor, it seemed like the perfect escape. The quiet, the solitude, it was everything I needed to clear my head. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time exploring the trails, reading by the fire, and enjoying the sound of nothing but wind through the trees. But after about a week, that peace began to unravel. It started with a feeling. I'd be out in the woods, walking the trails I'd mapped out, and I'd feel it, a sense that I wasn't alone. It wasn't the typical feeling of being watched, not at first. It was more subtle. I'd hear the crunch of leaves behind me, like someone or something was following. But every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trees and shadows. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, being so isolated could mess with your head. But the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. One evening, as the sun was setting and the woods were growing darker, I was out gathering firewood when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, behind the trees. I froze, straining to listen, but the growl didn't come again. I hurried back to the cabin, my nerves on edge. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin. At first, I thought they were from an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but these weren't like anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boots, with long, claw-like impressions dug deep into the dirt. They circled the cabin as if something had been pacing around it during the night. A chill ran down my spine. I spent the rest of the day indoors trying to distract myself with books and work, but I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. What kind of animal could make tracks like that? And why hadn't I heard it? The forest was quiet, but not that quiet. That night, I heard the growl again. This time, it was closer. I was lying in bed when I heard the sound just outside the window. It was low and menacing, like something was standing right there, watching me. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, peeking through the curtain. But all I saw was darkness and the trees swaying in the wind. The growl came again, this time from the other side of the cabin. I whipped the flashlight toward the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Something was out there, circling the cabin, just like before. I stayed up all night, clutching the flashlight and a kitchen knife, waiting for the thing to break in. But it never did. The growling stopped just before dawn, and when I went outside, the tracks were there again, fresh. They were bigger this time, and closer to the door. I needed answers. The nearest town was a long drive, but I had no choice. I packed a bag, locked the cabin, and drove straight to the local general store, hoping someone there might know what was happening. Old Jim, the store owner, had lived in the area his whole life. When I mentioned the strange footprints, he went pale. "You didn't stay out there, did you?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded, confused. "Why?" He leaned in, his eyes dark. "There's something in those woods. Always has been. Locals call it the Watcher. No one knows what it is, but we all know not to go too deep into the forest. It stalks you, watches you, and if you see it, it's too late." I laughed nervously, thinking he was trying to scare me, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. "That cabin you bought," Jim continued, "used to belong to a hunter named Grady. He was out there for years, living off the land. One day he just vanished. They say the Watcher took him." I left the store, my mind racing. The rational part of me didn't believe in local legends or forest spirits, but the fear I'd felt was real. Something was out there, and I couldn't explain it. That night, I made a decision. I'd leave the cabin and never come back. I packed my things, but just as I was about to load up the truck, the growling started again. Louder this time. Closer. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, and stepped outside. The forest was darker than usual, the trees casting long, twisted shadows. I swung the beam of light across the yard, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Its body was shrouded in shadow, but I could make out the vague shape of something monstrous. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The Watcher tilted its head as if studying me, and then it stepped forward. The growl rumbled through the air, deep and threatening. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, leaving everything behind. I jumped into my truck, slammed the door, and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The growling faded as I drove away, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I still feel it, the eyes in the dark, the presence in the woods, watching, waiting, and I know deep down that the Watcher never forgets.
Story number 6.
When I first moved into the old house, I was excited. It was cheap, had character, and was tucked away on a quiet street. The previous owners had left in a hurry, leaving most of the furniture behind, which was strange, but I didn't question it too much. Old houses come with their quirks, and I liked the idea of living in a place with history. The house had 3 bedrooms, but one of them was different. The third room was at the end of the hallway, smaller than the others, and had no windows. The door was always closed, and there was something about that room that gave me a chill every time I walked past it. Maybe it was the strange draft that seemed to seep from under the door, or the fact that the air around it always felt colder than the rest of the house. For the first few days, I avoided it. I didn't need to use all the rooms anyway, and I had plenty of unpacking to do. But one evening, as I was setting up my bookshelves in the living room, I heard something, a faint noise, like soft whispers. I paused, listening carefully. The sound was coming from the hallway. I walked toward it slowly, and as I got closer, I realized the whispers were coming from the closed door of the third room. My heart started to race. I stood outside the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The whispers grew louder, like multiple voices murmuring just behind the door, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the house had some sort of strange acoustics, and sounds from the outside were filtering in. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was empty, dark, silent. The air inside was thick, colder than I expected, and the walls seemed to press in on me. I looked around, shining the light from my phone into the corners. There was nothing unusual, just an old wooden floor and bare walls. The whispers had stopped. I shut the door quickly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being ridiculous. But that night, the whispers came again. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard them. Soft, insistent, like they were coming from the walls themselves. I got up, heart pounding, and crept down the hallway. As I approached the third room, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be calling to me, drawing me closer. I stood outside the door, my hand trembling on the knob. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking. The room was dark, but this time the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, clearer, I could almost make out words, but they were in a language I didn't understand. Something old, something wrong. My skin prickled with fear. The room seemed wrong. The walls were too close, the floor too uneven. It was as if the space itself was bending, warping in some unnatural way. And then I saw it. In the far corner, the shadows seemed to thicken, forming a shape. It was a figure, hunched and twisted, barely visible in the dim light. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning with a malevolent intensity. The whispers grew frantic, more desperate, filling the room with a sense of dread so strong I felt like I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I backed away down the hallway, my pulse racing. Whatever was in that room wasn't human, and it wanted me to come closer. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house sending me into a state of panic. The whispers continued, though now they seemed muffled, as if the door was struggling to keep them contained. I thought about leaving, but the logical part of me still clung to the hope that there was a rational explanation, that maybe, just maybe, I was imagining things. The next morning, I called a friend, Sam, to come over. I didn't tell him the full story, just that I was hearing strange noises, and I wanted him to check out the house. He arrived a couple of hours later, laughing it off as old house sounds. Together, we walked down the hallway to the third room. I hesitated at the door, without feeling the familiar chill creeping under the crack. Sam, of course, didn't believe me. He swung the door open confidently, stepping inside with a smirk. But the moment he entered, his face changed. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was sucking the warmth out of the room. Sam froze, his eyes widening as he stared at the far wall. His expression went from cocky to horrified in seconds. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The whispers were louder now, circling us, filling the room with an eerie cacophony of voices. I could feel something in the room with us. The shadows moved, crawling along the walls, closing in. Sam backed out, his face pale, and I slammed the door shut behind him. We stood in the hallway, both breathing heavily. He didn't laugh anymore. "I don't know what that is," he said quietly, "but you need to get out of this house. Now." I didn't argue. I left that day, packing only what I could carry. I never went back to that house, and I never found out what was really in that room. The whispers, the figure, the unnatural cold, all of it haunts me to this day. I've tried to forget, but every now and then when I'm alone, I still hear it. That faint, insistent whisper, calling my name. I'll never open that door again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
When I inherited my grandparents' house, I didn't think much of it. They'd passed away years ago, and the place had been sitting empty ever since. It was an old Victorian home, dusty and creaky, but charming in a nostalgic sort of way. The kind of place that looked like it belonged in a ghost story. But I didn't believe in any of that. At least not until I found the mirror. It was my second day there, and I was cleaning out the attic. The attic was cluttered with forgotten furniture, old trunks, and yellowed photographs, most of which I didn't recognize. I was digging through an old chest when I noticed it, covered by a thick, tattered cloth propped up against the far wall. The mirror was huge, framed in ornate, gilded wood. The glass was slightly tarnished with age, but I could still see my reflection clearly. It looked ancient, like something you'd find in a museum, and I wondered why my grandparents had hidden it away. I pulled off the cloth completely and wiped the dust from the surface. As soon as I did, I felt a strange unease wash over me. The air around the mirror felt colder, heavier, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the reflection. Not behind me, but within the mirror itself, like a shadow passing behind glass. I stepped back, blinking. The attic was still. My reflection stared back at me, just as it should. I shook my head, brushing off the weird feeling, and decided to move the mirror downstairs. It was too beautiful to leave hidden away. That night, I placed the mirror in the living room, hanging it on the wall above the fireplace. As I sat on the couch, sipping a glass of wine and scrolling through my phone, I kept glancing up at it. The way the firelight flickered in the glass was hypnotic, casting strange shadows that danced across the room. And then, I saw it again. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved in the mirror. It was subtle, like a dark figure shifting just out of sight, but when I looked directly at the reflection, there was nothing. Just me, the room, and the fire. I tried to ignore it, but my unease grew. Every time I looked at the mirror, it felt like I was being watched. Not by my reflection, but by something else, something hidden behind the glass. That night I went to bed with a strange heaviness in my chest. I told myself I was just tired, that moving into an old house was making me jumpy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was more than just a piece of furniture. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like soft footsteps or the creak of a door. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding. The house was silent, but I felt that same cold presence, like someone was standing in the room with me. I got up and crept down the stairs, my bare feet padding softly against the wooden floor. The air grew colder as I approached the living room, and that's when I saw it. The figure in the mirror. It was tall and shadowy, standing just behind my reflection, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't just a trick of the fire this time. I could see it clearly. A dark silhouette looming behind me, watching. I froze, my blood running cold. I wanted to turn around to see if it was behind me, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the mirror, on that figure. It was getting closer, slowly, its shadow stretching toward me like long, twisted fingers. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my pulse racing. The room was empty. I turned on every light in the house, checking every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the mirror, hanging silently on the wall. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring at the mirror, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. The house remained quiet, and by morning, I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But then it happened again. The next night, I woke to the same sound, the soft creaking, the sense of something moving in the house. I rushed downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest, and there it was. The figure, standing in the mirror, closer this time. I could see it more clearly now, its shape defined by the flickering firelight. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by darkness. I backed away, panic rising. The figure didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me, boring into me through the glass. I grabbed a blanket from the couch and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. The room fell into an eerie silence, and the cold presence faded just slightly. The next morning, I called a local antiques dealer to ask about the mirror. The man on the phone was silent for a moment when I described it, and then he asked, "Where did you say you found it?" "In the attic," I replied, "at my grandparents' house." He hesitated. "That mirror, it's not just an antique, there's something wrong with it. Years ago, a man was found dead in front of it in that same house. They said he was staring at his own reflection when he died." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "They say the mirror shows you things," he continued quietly, "things you're not supposed to see. And if you stare too long, well, some people never come back from it." I hung up, my hands shaking. That evening, I removed the mirror from the wall, dragged it up to the attic, and covered it with the old cloth. I wanted to smash it, but something stopped me. Fear, or maybe something more. I didn't want to risk releasing whatever was trapped inside. For now, the mirror remains in the attic, covered and forgotten. But every night I still hear the creak of footsteps, the soft rustle of something moving through the house. And I know deep down that the mirror is waiting, watching. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I had always heard the stories about the old well at the edge of town. Every small town has its urban legends, and ours was no different. They said it was cursed, that a girl had fallen down it decades ago and her spirit still haunted the dark stone walls. But that was just folklore, something the kids whispered around campfires to scare each other. At least, that's what I thought until I heard the voice. It was late autumn, and I'd been house-sitting for my aunt while she was away. Her place was old, nestled at the end of a long, winding dirt road that led through a dense forest, the kind of place that felt completely isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. I liked the peace, though. I was trying to finish a writing project, and the solitude helped me focus. About a mile from the house, tucked deep in the woods, was the well. I'd heard the stories growing up, but I never had a reason to go near it, until one evening, curiosity got the better of me. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow through the trees, when I decided to take a walk. I followed the path through the woods, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the well. It was just as eerie as the rumors had described. Old, overgrown with moss, and covered by a rusted iron grate. The stone around the top was crumbling, worn down by time and weather. I stood there, staring at it, feeling a strange sense of unease. The air around the well seemed colder, heavier, like the trees were holding their breath. I told myself it was just an old, abandoned well, nothing more. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a voice. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves, but unmistakable, a soft, distant whisper like someone calling out from deep underground. "Hello." I froze, my heart racing. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." I turned back to the well, my blood running cold. I took a few hesitant steps closer, my pulse thudding in my ears. The voice was so soft, so distant, it almost didn't seem real. "Please, help me." I leaned over the edge of the well, peering through the rusted grate into the darkness below. I couldn't see anything, just a deep, yawning blackness that seemed to go on forever. My breath caught in my throat. Was someone down there? Had someone fallen in? But that didn't make sense. The well had been sealed off for years. No one could get in, and there was no way anyone could survive a fall that deep. Still, the voice persisted. "I'm trapped. Please. I can't get out." It sounded like a girl, her voice weak and trembling, full of desperation. Every instinct told me to turn and run, to get as far away from that well as possible, but something kept me rooted to the spot. What if someone really was down there? What if the stories weren't just stories? Who are you? I called out, my voice shaky. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought the voice was gone. But then it came again, soft and pleading. "I'm lost. I've been here for so long. Please help me." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no way I could lift the grate by myself. It was rusted shut, too heavy to move. And even if I could, what then? Was I really going to climb down into that darkness, into that well? "Please, don't leave me." The voice sounded closer now, clearer. It echoed up from the depths, filling the air around me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. The longer I stood there, the more unnatural the voice sounded, like it wasn't coming from a real person at all. It was too smooth, too calm, despite the words it spoke. And then I heard something else. A faint rustling, like movement. I leaned in closer, straining to see through the darkness, and that's when I saw it. Eyes. Two pale, glowing eyes staring up at me from the depths of the well. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And the voice, it changed. The pleading tone was gone, replaced by something darker, more sinister. "Come closer." I shook my head, backing away, my hands trembling. The voice echoed in my ears, louder now, insistent. "Don't go. Come closer." I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tore through the woods, the voice following me, growing louder, more distorted with each step. "Come back!" I didn't stop until I reached the house, slamming the door behind me, locking it tight. My chest heaved as I tried to calm myself, but the image of those eyes burned in my mind. The voice still echoed in my ears, faint but persistent, like it was calling me from miles away. For the rest of the night, I sat in the living room, every light in the house turned on, listening. The woods outside were silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother telling anyone what I'd heard or seen. Who would believe me? The well was just an old, forgotten relic, and the stories about it were just that, stories. But I know what I heard, I know what I saw, and sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear it. The voice, calling. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. My friends and I had rented a cabin in the woods, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The cabin was quaint, rustic, with creaky floors and a fireplace that never quite seemed to warm the room. It was surrounded by dense trees, the kind that blocked out the sky and made you feel like you were miles away from civilization. I loved it at first, the isolation, the quiet. But that was before I saw the shadow. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, full of energy, eager for a weekend of hiking, drinking, and campfire stories. By the time night fell, the temperature had dropped, and we huddled around the fire inside, laughing and joking, the warmth of the flames flickering across our faces. It was around midnight when things started to feel wrong. The others didn't notice it at first, but I did. The air in the cabin grew colder, despite the fire burning strong. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch farther than they should, flickering unnaturally. And then there was the feeling, like we weren't alone. I brushed it off, blaming it on the atmosphere. Old cabins in the woods were supposed to feel creepy, right? That's what made them charming. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease grew. Around 2 a.m., we decided to call it a night. The others stumbled off to their rooms, but I wasn't tired. Something was bothering me, gnawing at the back of my mind. So I sat in the living room, watching the fire die down, staring out the large picture window that looked out into the pitch-black woods. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow moving just beyond the window. It was subtle, barely noticeable, like a figure shifting in the darkness. I squinted, leaning forward, trying to make it out, but there was nothing. Just trees swaying in the breeze. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw it again. A shape, dark, tall, standing just beyond the trees, motionless, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat there staring out into the darkness, my heart racing. Had I imagined it? I must have. The woods played tricks on your eyes at night. Everyone knew that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hiding just beyond the edge of the light. I forced myself to stand, to turn away from the window, and headed to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old cabin, the wind rustling through the trees outside. And then, footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible, like someone walking across the wooden porch outside. I sat up, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, pacing back and forth just outside the door. My heart raced. I got out of bed, moving as quietly as I could, and crept to the window in my room. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, and that's when I saw it again. The shadow. It stood at the edge of the porch, its figure barely visible in the moonlight, tall and still. I couldn't make out any features, just darkness. But I knew it was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I couldn't see them. My breath quickened, and I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering in my chest. For what felt like hours, I stayed in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the footsteps outside. They stopped eventually, but the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, I told my friends what I had seen. They laughed it off, saying it was probably just my imagination or a deer wandering too close to the cabin. I tried to laugh with them, but deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. I knew what I had seen. The second night was worse. We were sitting around the fire again, this time with drinks, trying to push the unease from the previous night out of our minds. But I couldn't relax. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see the shadow standing there, watching, waiting. Around midnight, the power went out. The fire flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. My friends groaned, stumbling around, trying to find flashlights. I sat frozen in my seat, staring out the window, heart pounding in my chest. The darkness outside seemed thicker now, more oppressive. And then I saw it. The shadow was closer this time, standing just outside the window, motionless. Its form was more defined now, tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch out into the night. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching us, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to warn my friends, but the words stuck in my throat. Slowly, the shadow raised one of its long, twisted arms and pointed at me. The cabin grew colder, the air heavy with something dark, something wrong. My friends were still laughing, unaware of the thing standing just outside, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the room was filled with warmth again. My friends didn't notice my pale face, my shaking hands. They didn't see what I had seen. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even go to my room. I sat by the fire, watching the window, waiting for the shadow to return. When morning came, I packed my things and left, making up some excuse about an emergency back home. I didn't care if my friends believed me or not. I just needed to get out of there. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that the shadow followed me, that it's still watching, waiting. And every night when I glance out my window, I half expect to see it standing there at the edge of the trees, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
When I was a kid, my parents always warned me about the woods behind our house. They'd say things like, "Don't go too far," or "Stay on the main path." I thought it was just them being overprotective. After all, they were just woods, trees, and animals, nothing more. Or so I thought. It wasn't until years later, after I'd moved back home as an adult, that I realized my parents had been trying to protect me from something far more sinister than wild animals or getting lost. They were trying to protect me from the whispers. I'd moved back to take care of the house after my mom passed. It was an old place, isolated on the edge of a small town. My dad had died when I was younger, so it was just me and my memories, rattling around in the empty rooms. The first few weeks were quiet, filled with grief and the suffocating weight of silence. Then I started hearing the whispers, It was subtle at first. I'd be outside, tending to the garden, or just walking along the old path through the backyard, and I'd hear something, a faint murmur, like distant voices carried on the breeze. I'd stop, listening, but it always faded away before I could make out any words. I told myself it was just the wind, rustling the leaves, nothing more, but the whispers grew louder. One evening, as the sun was setting and the woods were bathed in that eerie twilight glow, I decided to take a walk. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs as I wandered down the familiar path that led into the trees. The woods felt different now, darker, more imposing, but I brushed it off, determined to clear my mind. About a mile in, the path forked. To the left, the trail continued deeper into the forest, a place I'd rarely gone. To the right, it circled back toward the house. I stood there for a moment, considering, and then, against my better judgment, I turned left. That's when the whispers started again. At first, it was just a low hum, like someone speaking just out of earshot. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the voices grew clearer, more insistent. "Come closer." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't just the wind. It was a voice, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, but there was something wrong about it. Something that sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around, but there was no one there, just the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. "Please, come closer." The voice echoed through the woods, wrapping around me like a cold breeze. I should have turned back right then, should have run back to the house and locked the door. But something in the voice, something about the way it whispered my name, pulled me forward. I continued down the path, the trees growing denser, the air colder. The sun had almost completely set now, and the woods were cast in shadows. My breath puffed out in small clouds as I walked, the whispers growing louder with each step. They were everywhere now, coming from all directions. "Come closer. We've been waiting for you." The voices overlapped, whispering my name, beckoning me deeper into the forest. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't stop. It was like something had taken hold of me, like the voices were inside my head, pulling me forward. And then I saw it. In the distance, just off the path, there was a clearing. And in the center of that clearing stood an old, crumbling stone well. The sight of it sent a wave of cold terror through me. I didn't remember ever seeing a well out here before, and something about it felt wrong. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my breath shallow. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around me like a storm. "Come closer. We're waiting." I took a step forward, drawn toward the well despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. The air around it was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. The closer I got, the colder it became until I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was sudden, oppressive. My ears rang in the absence of the voices, and for a brief moment I felt like I was completely alone. But I wasn't. I could feel something watching me from the depths of the well. I stepped closer, peering over the edge into the darkness below. I don't know why I did it, why I didn't just run. But as I looked down, I saw something move. It was faint, barely visible in the pitch-black depths, but it was there. A shadow shifting just out of sight. And then it spoke. "I've been waiting for you." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was right there, inches away from me, echoing up from the well. My blood turned to ice as I stumbled back, my heart racing. The shadow in the well moved again, closer, and I could see it now. Long, twisted limbs, pale and gaunt, reaching up toward the edge. I turned and ran. The woods were a blur around me as I sprinted back toward the house, the whispers chasing me, growing louder and more frantic. "Don't leave. Come back." I didn't stop until I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, my breath ragged and my chest heaving. The house was silent, the only sound the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stayed up all night, sitting by the window, watching the edge of the woods, waiting for the whispers to return. But they never did. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay there, not after what I'd heard, not after what I'd seen. But even now, miles away, I can still hear the whispers, faint in the back of my mind, calling me, beckoning me. And I know deep down that they're still waiting in the woods. Story the end.